Hello everybody, I thought I would review this video from EFDawah where they are discussing evolution. Let's see what they have to say.
Doesn't the Quran say that Adam was formed out of mud?
Clay, dust, it mentions this sort of
would
thing.
you say that, or would you say that we have evolved from other beings?
So we'll come to this. So. We don't believe Adam as himself was and evolved from a common ancestor. Because why? We have something that we've established using our rational logic to come from the Creator, the Quran, which specifically says, "I created Adam with my own hands." So we know there was no precursor to this creature.
At the start they make it clear their belief is in the religious claim of a miraculous creation of Adam. There is no scientific evidence of this, so it's not scientific.
So the question then comes, well, how do we deal with the theory of the human evolution, isn't it? That's the question then. The clear-cutness is that we're told that that Adam was a special creation. This is clear.
Yeah.
Now, the reason the difficulty comes is because we have this theory of evolution, which is based upon the assumption that everything that we have has to be explained naturally. You can't have a non-natural explanation.
Okay, exactly.
Evolution is the best supported naturalistic theory. There is no way to test for the non-natural or supernatural, so you can't include the non-natural in science. The burden of proof is on the person making the supernatural claim to demonstrate it.
We share 99% of our DNA with a mouse.
So we mice.
Yeah, so what?
But the thing is with evolution is that, and this is not a belief, you can take the DNA of all species and you can make a phylogenetic tree and trace it back.
I'll come to this. So there's lots of errors. There's lots of we need to look at the paradigm that people use to come up with these statements. Really, it's really important to do that. We share 50% of our DNA with bananas. But the question is, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything in the big context of things. But let's start with the basics.
Because it could be that's like the default programming language that God used to create everything. No, I'm just saying.
Yeah, you're right.
And which is DNA, right? And so there could be similarities.
It means a lot in the big context of things because it's not just about that we share DNA, but that we share a higher percentage and express similar genes to species that are more closely related to us. This is evidence of evolution by natural selection and a common descent from a shared ancestor.
But it is the basic code of life. But then if we get a child, the child is going to have 50% of my DNA and 50% of his DNA. Their children are going to have 25, and so on.
You know why I'm asking this question?
DNA is a language that it cannot be ignored.
But what I'm saying to you is that similarity doesn't necessitate that there is a... sorry, okay.
No, you're right.
I'm interrupting you.
I'm trying to build. So, because saying is, so even in evolution, because we have a naturalist worldview, there is an assumption within this, and there are some unfalsifiable assumptions within evolution that exist that lead to only one interpretation of the data available. What's the key underlying premise of evolution? You said
Natural selection.
No, so that's the mechanism, but an assumption of the evolution. What it is? What is the assumption? The underlying assumption in evolution is that everything comes from a common ancestor.
Yeah.
Okay.
You mean? Yeah.
That's an assumption.
Yeah. True.
It's not the assumption, it's the conclusion based on the evidence. As the geneticist and evolutionary biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. A pattern of species diverging from a common ancestor is by far the most likely conclusion reached from analysing all the evidence.
And it's unfalsifiable.
It can be falsified. Any of these would falsify it.
Is it?
It's unfalsifiable.
Okay, fine. Okay.
So let's do the experiment. So any piece of data that we get, say if we find, let's say we find a fossil that doesn't fit any of our trees that we've made. Because these trees that we make are just us and interpreting the data and putting on a tree because we assume that everything has a common ancestor. There's other ways to interpret this if you take this assumption away. Can there be multiple? So you've heard of the Cambrian explosion. So this is when suddenly we find lots of fossils appearing of quite advanced life forms that remain to this day unchanged, particularly from that time. It's difficult to explain this in the understanding of small gradual change over time.
Oh dear, a common creationist error in using the Cambrian expansion. All these claims have been dismissed in this video from Professor Dave on Stephen Meyer.
So there was a professor called Gould who came up with the theory that something called punctuated equilibrium, where evolution becomes rapid development and then slows down and then rapid development.
Stephen Jay Gould may have popularized punctuated equilibrium, but even Darwin in the first edition of On the Origin of Species was aware that different species changed at different rates over time.
Now that was a mathematical theory. Gould was a mathematician.
That's wrong. Stephen Jay Gould was a paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and historian of science.
But he was trying to explain the fossil data because the fossil data didn't fit with gradual. You couldn't see gradual evolution. You saw suddenly quite well advanced life appearing in the Cambrian explosion. So he came up with this theory. Now the theory explains the evolution, but what counters it is actually the genetic data. And why? Because in genes, what we understand is, and you've got to remember, Darwin was not aware of genes. He didn't know about them. This came after him. So his theory was, he would see all these creatures that looked similar, and he said they're probably related. And that simple observation led to the idea that, well, maybe all of life came from something original, and he didn't know the mechanism of how it separated. But he assumed that there was some way of these creatures evolving. Now, the assumption was, this unfalsified assumption is that that everything has a common ancestor. So any piece of data you get, so if I find a piece of fossil now, and I'm looking and I'm thinking, oh, this is all my trees, it doesn't fit into it anywhere. What am I going to do with that data?
If you find a fossil that doesn't fit into the current model, you can classify it under the taxonomic headings. If you can't even classify its domain, then you have something truly remarkable. But that hasn't happened yet. This supports common ancestry of all biological organisms as the most likely explanation.
We all do value truth, right? We value truth. We would like to find out, as to the best of our ability, as to where the truth lies. That's a noble cause. That's a noble goal, I think. And the Quran says something very interesting as well. If you speak the truth, provide your evidence. So it's not just about blind faith. So you've used the word divisive a few times. And I would say that these discussions can become divisive, but they don't have to be.
Of course.
So the sister can say, look, I'm a scientist and this is the evidence that perhaps convinces me of X or Y. It's perfectly okay. And the brother can say, okay, but let's have a look at that and we can discuss that. That's not a problem. And in fact, I think we should actually strive to do that.
Where do your thoughts lie on just evolution? So
I have no problem with evolution.
But do you believe that we and chimps used to have a common ancestor that split at some point throughout history? Because a lot of people, when I speak to, that are very religious, but without critical thought, just pure belief, really struggle with this ideology and they take it offensively.
Yes.
So there's two things that when I see this, there's two things that I do. One is you look at the data, the evidence. So if you look at the studies that they did of these, so they say approximately 2 million years ago that there was a common ancestor for humans and chimps, and they're separated. And some of the evidence they say is that because if you look at chimps, they have 2 extra chromosomes than we do. And they say there was a merging of chromosomes 16 and 2, and you can see some evidence of this.
Yeah.
And the evidence they point to is at the ends of the chromosomes, they have something called telomeres, which are a long chain of repeating DNA. And the idea is that this is something that breaks down with time and is linked to aging. If you see a section of this in the middle of a section of DNA where you don't normally find them, and they say this is evidence of the joining.
Normally a chromosome has just 1 centromere, but in human chromosome 2 there are 2 centromeres. Also, telomeres are normally found at the end of a chromosome, but in chromosome 2 there are telomeres far from the end. The most plausible explanation is that human chromosome 2 is the result of an end-to-end fusion of 2 ancestral chromosomes.
So there's a couple of things. So when I am looking at this, I have two worldviews that I need to reconcile. One is I'm a Muslim. I establish for myself that there is a creator. This is the only reasonable explanation for the universe existing. So, for example, Allah says in the Quran, did the universe come from nothing or did it create itself? Rhetorical questions. Nothing can come from nothing. 0 plus 0 plus 0 is always 0. So it has to come from something. It can't make itself because it has to exist before it makes it. So it has to come from somewhere.
So he has deviated to the first cause argument. Let's skip this bit as it's not relevant to evolution.
Then we see consciousness. Consciousness we can't reduce down to a material. We can't look in a microscope to see consciousness. There are many theories put forward, but they're all lacking. The best thing is emergent, which just means it just came about, really. Now, I would say that if something doesn't have a quality, it can't give that quality. So non-consciousness, no matter what you do with it, cannot, however much you put together, will never bring about consciousness. So the fact that we have consciousness means that there was that this thing in the beginning, the necessary thing, was also conscious.
That's just an argument from incredulity. There's no evidence for his assertion. It's an attempt to define a conscious first cause into existence. Please watch my other videos on consciousness.
So I can come rationally to the conclusion that there has to be a creator who created this. But then when I look around at evidences, you see the Quran, you know about the linguistic nature of the Quran is very, very sublime.
I'm not an expert in religious literature, but this claim is debunked by these videos by Abdullah Samir and Abdullah Gondal. I will link them in the description.
What makes it even more amazing is that the Prophet was illiterate. Could not read or write.
Illiterate is not important. Most people at the time were. He could still communicate and remember. What's more impressive is Stevie Wonder composing music and playing the piano while being blind, or Urban Le Verrier using mathematics and physics to discover the position of Neptune without using a calculator.
Now when it comes to this data of the human-chimp genomes, etc., I've looked at the data. Sorry, you're not going to like this. I don't find it convincing. Why? Because if you look at the telomere length, how big are telomeres generally? Do you know an idea?
It depends. They decrease with aging.
So if you take a creature, how long would you expect? How many thousands?
But it also depends on the efficiency of the telomeres within an organism. There's no one answer.
But they're usually very large.
At the beginning of birth, they are very large.
So when we look at
the telomeres of different organisms are different in length and efficiency of repair.
But if the way the data set works is, we look at the current human genome, and we look at the chimpanzee equivalent of what we think has merged, and because they come from the common ancestor, the assumption is they come from a common ancestor, then what you should find is the same number of base pairs as we see between the human beings. Even if you take a range controlled for age, so even if you vary the age and the telomere length that we see in that is very tiny, small amount, 150 base pairs or something, very, very tiny. That's one thing for me.
Human telomeres typically measure between 5 and 15,000 base pairs. Telomeres shorten over time due to degradation, but they do not drop from 5 to 15,000 base pairs to just 150 base pairs. You find telomeres that short in yeast. Also, nobody says human chromosome 2 has the same number of base pairs as the two combined chimpanzee chromosomes, as there has been about 6 million years of evolution since humans and chimpanzees diverged.
The second thing is, if you express it, what was your background? You said you were.
I'm a molecular biologist by training.
Perfect. You know this excellently. So, what was if you have a chain of DNA, the DNA is when it produces proteins. It's just a language.
So every 3 base pairs are transcribed into a codon. Every codon is an amino acid, which translates into a protein.
A protein, yeah. So the idea is that this is information that gets translated to produce a protein.
Yeah.
If you a mutation is if there's like a deletion or an addition, so either the code is offset by one amino acid, something like this.
Yeah.
In this confusing of the telomeres, is any data taken away?
How do you mean?
Is any information removed?
Some subtelomeric DNA was lost during the fusion.
But the telomeres are not coded.
No, not coding.
No.
So what's the answer to the question then? Is any information removed?
But the thing is, no one can really answer that question, because when you're thinking of humans and chimpanzees and you're saying they have a common ancestor, the only way we can formulate that argument is if you're assuming from that one common ancestor you had nothing until Homo sapiens and then you had nothing other than chimpanzees. Well, that's not really the case, because from that common ancestor there were many different branches of many different species.
I understand the theory. So the question I'm asking is really specific. If you join the telomeres of it doesn't matter which creature, any creatures, you join the telomeres of 2 chromosomes together, is there any deletion of information?
From the DNA, no.
Yes, there is, as demonstrated here in this article, which I will link in the description.
All of the information can still be expressed.
Yeah.
Yes. So why would the creatures be different?
Because creatures on a protein level are not different. The proteins that is found in every cell in your body is found in every cell in a pig, in a cat, in a dog, and everything. The way the cellular machinery works is universal, even down to a bacteria, but they just have the structure differently. The difference is which part of the DNA is actually read. And even in your body, your skin cell, your blood cell, and your bone cell are reading different parts of the DNA. So that's why even within you will have different readings.
Species differ not just in the number of chromosomes and the number of genes, but on whether those genes are active or inactive and whether they are translated into proteins or not.
I understand. So the question again is if there's no data deleted, and remember we have on signals and off signals for reading a piece of DNA, I'm looking at how I go about reconciling for myself that I don't find this personally convincing.
I'm afraid whether science is right or wrong does not depend on what you find convincing or not.
There are many things. Now, one is that I have the understanding of my religious paradigm.
Yeah.
And if you followed a different religion, then you would have followed a different religious paradigm.
The second thing, I assume and I understand that there's an unfalsifiable foundation of Darwinian evolution, which is it assumes a common ancestor, irrespective of any way of falsifying it. You can't falsify that.
Again, as I demonstrated earlier, you can falsify it, and a common ancestor is the logical conclusion of the evidence and not the initial assumption.
Is it contradicting anything in religion, in Islam? Because the idea of, again, back to what I was saying before, right? Even if came from where derivation, like at one point in time human beings evolved from another being or whatever. Does it contradict in some way?
So I'll tell you the different explanations I've come across in my time.
Yeah.
So one is the commonly held that Adam alayhi salam has no predecessor. Yeah, this is one.
Predecessor.
Let me explain the differences. Yeah, so this is one of them. The other one is that, and the other extreme is that all of evolution as secularly understood or using the scientific method is the case.
Yeah.
And the difference between Adam alayhi salam and the other creatures is a soul was infused, and this soul brings about the consciousness. It brings about the cultural changes we see about 50, 60,000 years ago.
Yeah.
We start to find art painting, paintings on the walls, and even that's going further back now, more than 100,000
or something, yeah.
We start to see culture appearing, and that's we see cultivation of the land. This might be that. So that's one explanation, and the other one is an in between of the two. Yeah. The problem that I have.
There is another one as well, actually.
There's in between at the end.
Well, there's one where Adam is created fully formed, and the descendants of Adam somehow had DNA sharing with species that what they were able to mate with. Of course, this is not accepted generally
This is
within
between,
consensus, but the DNA traits that you find with Neanderthals and other species are therefore explained because there was some sharing of data of DNA later. But again, I must emphasize that generally this is not a. So what I'm trying to say to you is that from the same data, potentially you could come up with other theories, but science would never accept that and say that Adam was fully formed and that his descendants later somehow were able to share DNA with another species, and therefore they share their traits and the bacteria and everything else that we talk about. But sorry, so that's
sure. But the key thing is that we can't take something that's clear, qati, we can't take that something clear and interpret in a way that's against that clearness. If there's something is ambiguous, because Allah specifically says that we created Adam with our own hands, we know that this was a different type of creation to other things.
Yeah.
We don't deny evolution, so 99.99% of evolution we have no issues with at all. But just a human being we believe is exception to this.
But can I ask a question? What would you say to the fact that maybe when God sent down the message, it couldn't explain, or he couldn't explain the evolution and the biological mechanisms behind it?
God.
maybe he didn't want to. She's probably saying,
Maybe
not that he
in
couldn't.
the message,
Okay.
it was just formulated in a way
So
where
people would understand.
back then,
Yeah.
with their scientific knowledge, could just understand
At that
how
time,
humans
yeah.
came about.
But sister, can I just ask you a question? Because you're a scientist, right? Clearly, this description of Adam being created without any prior creation, simply willed Adam to existence.
From nothing.
Would science ever be able to explore or really comment on a supernatural event?
That's
Because it's unscientific. It's not
outside of the
science. It's
paradigm.
outside of science, what I'm trying to say to you.
The borders of science, I think, they're not as determined as people would like them, as you would like to think.
Do
right?
you know
So-
what I believe, sister? To be honest with you,
Yeah.
right? I think from a scientific paradigm, the best explanation that we have is human-chimp ancestry. From a scientific paradigm. So if you were to tell me, explain it from a non-theological sense, without miracles, without anything else, I would say that's the strongest theory.
Okay.
Because that's what it seems to be the only possibility,
Assuming
right?
naturalism-
Assuming naturalism is true and there's no other explanation. But as Imran is trying to explain to you is that there are certain things that we believe are supernatural and fall outside of that box,
You can't measure them.
which you have no yardstick now to measure.
Yeah.
That's a magic word, yardstick.
using the tool of science, because science is based on philosophical naturalism.
No, science is based on methodological naturalism, not philosophical naturalism. Science doesn't rule out the supernatural entirely, but until science can test for and demonstrate the supernatural, then science has to exclude the supernatural from scientific theories. Once we start to include any supernatural beliefs within science, then we have to include all of them, as there is no way to differentiate between them and accept some or discard others.
In other words, there is nothing that falls out of a natural explanation. Even quantum physics, we might not understand where these particles come from, but we will never, even if we never find out, will we ever come to a point where we'll say it's a miracle? No, we'll simply say, in the future, there might be some evidence or experimentation where we will gain the explanation as to where those particles seem to pop in and out of.
We can't conclude a supernatural or miraculous cause once we have ruled out all known natural possibilities, as how can we rule out natural possibilities of which we do not know anything about yet? This is the fault of the supernatural for not showing itself to us in a clear form. In summary, the original video showed a limited understanding of science, especially evolution, and they relied on faith to dismiss the science we know. Thank you for watching, and please let me know what you think in the comments section.